webinar is now live.
You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Let's go way on, way back when. I didn't even know you couldn't have been too much more than 10. I ain't no psychiatrist, I ain't no doctor with degrees, but it don't take too much time to see what you're doing to me. You better think about what you're trying to do to me, yeah. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Oh, freedom, 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 oh, freedom, yeah, freedom, now freedom, 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 need some freedom, oh, freedom, hey, think about it, think about it, ain't nothing you could ask I could answer you what I want, but I was gonna change, I'm not if you keep doing things I don't. You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Oh, think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. People walk around every day playing games, taking scores, trying to make other people lose their mind. Well, be careful you don't lose yours. Oh, think about what you're trying to do to me. Woo-hoo. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. You need me, and I need you. Without each other, ain't nothing even can do. Oh, think about it, baby. What you trying to do to me? Come on, baby. Think about it right now. Yeah, right now. Oh, think about it, right now. Think about it, baby. Oh, to the bottom, baby.
Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Kimberly Phillip, and I am with the AWID's Co-Creating Feminist Realities Initiative and Forum team. I'll be one of the facilitators with you today. Before we jump into it, I just want to let you know that this conversation today is being translated into French and Spanish, as well as English. So at the bottom of your screens, you'll see an interpretation button. You just have to click the interpretation button, the channel that you need to listen to. So if you click that interpretation button, you'll see English, French, and Spanish. Pick the language that you need to listen in. And I'll have Danny just explain that in Spanish and French for everyone.
Thank you, Kimberly. Gracias, Kimberly. Y buenos días, buenas tardes. Pequeñas indicaciones de Zoom para que podamos aprovechar mejor la sesión. La primera en español es para usar la herramienta de interpretación y poder seguir toda la sesión en español. Verán que abajo en el control de cambios tienen un mundo que dice interpretación. Hacen clic ahí y seleccionan Spanish o español como esté en su Zoom. Y hacen clic también en Mute Original Audio, y esto les va a permitir escuchar mejor. Y luego les invitamos también, para que tengan una mejor experiencia y visión de esta conversación, a ir vamos a dejar solamente en la pantalla a aquellas personas que están con video, que son parte del panel. Para esto pueden ir al icono donde tienen el video, y ahí verán que hay una flecha chiquita. Hacen clic en la flecha pequeña, y ahí seleccionan configuración de video. Y luego van a ver que hay una opción de ocultar todos los participantes que no usan video. Si ponen eso, solamente van a ir en la pantalla a las personas que participan de este fantástico panel, y aprovecho para presentar y agradecer a María José y a Maggie, que van a estar haciendo la interpretación en español. Voilà, maintenant je vais le dire en français, désolé pour mon petit accent. Je vais vous partager quelques instructions pour utiliser les outils de Zoom. Pour l'interprétation, vous pouvez sélectionner les icônes d'interprétation en bas de votre écran. Et là, vous sélectionnez français, French, and then, et après, Mute Original Audio. Et ça va vous permettre de mieux entendre. Et après, pour pouvoir voir dans votre écran seulement les personnes qui vont faire partie de ce magnifique panel. Vous pouvez choisir les icônes de les, je vais les lire, les petites flèches à côté de l'icône de vidéo. Là, vous pouvez sélectionner les paramètres de vidéo ou vidéo setting, si vous l'avez en français. Et après, dans les options de réunion, cochez masquer les participants qui n'ont pas de vidéo, hide all non-video participants en anglais, et ça va vous permettre seulement de voir les personnes dans le panel. Je profite aussi pour dire merci, un grand merci à Dorothée et Iris qui vont nous aider aujourd'hui avec la traduction en français. Et bonne continuation pour tout le monde.
Thanks so much, Danny. So as I started to introduce myself before, I'll just do so again. My name is Kimberly. I work at AWID as part of the Co-Creating Feminist Realities Initiative and the Forum team. And I will be co-facilitating with Mishi, who I will let introduce herself. And I use the pronouns she and her. So Mishi, I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, hello, good morning. I'm in Paraguay. My name is Michi. I'm part of RESURJ, and I will be moderating this amazing conversation with Kimberly. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Mishi. And I just want to also acknowledge Tamara Jade. Tamara Jade is beautifully curating and collecting our thoughts using graphic note-taking. And so you can see Tamara Jade's screen and are pointing to that. And thank you so much for joining us today, Tamara Jade, and helping to document this really important conversation. So why are we having this conversation today? As part of our feminist realities journey and really thinking deeply and trying to amplify the incredible transformative solutions that feminist movements are creating across the world, we thought it would be important to continue having these conversations, continue curating virtual spaces, particularly given the moment we're in, where meeting face-to-face is impossible in a lot of ways and also very risky for a lot of us. So we, as given our convening power as an international feminist movement support organization, we thought it would be really critical for us to continue holding these conversations and facilitating spaces for movements to gather and to amplify the messages and the important work that they are doing across the world. And so this conversation, which is specifically on challenging criminalizations, all forms of criminalizations, as well as resisting stigmas, is a conversation that is in some ways and in many ways still very new for feminist movements. When we think about the importance of centering and honoring the lives of those who use drugs and having an active stance against drug policy and the war against drugs, when we think about sex workers' rights, when we think about trans bodies and trans feminists who continue to be on the front lines, when we think about those with HIV and the stigmatization of their bodies, these conversations are really crucial for us to continue having and for us to be in solidarity as feminist movements. So we're really, really happy that you all have joined us today to have these conversations, to continue pushing our growing edges and being more accountable to the movements that are on the front lines and whose lives and experiences tend to get erased and forgotten. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll pass it over to Mishi.
Thank you, Kimberly. Welcome again, everyone. So at this time, we want to remind you that the principles of engagement that you all receive in one of the event's reminders. Remember that this is a space free of harassment and violence. And also we want to create a space where we can all be present. So in that sense, we have the interpreters here. I want to apologize with them in advance because sometimes I tend to speak too fast. I hope I'm not terrorize them today. And of course, it would be nice if you have the chance that you close other distractions like phone, like emails, like other devices that you can have there to distract you from this conversation. Also, we want to create a space where all forms of knowledge are valuable and valued. So we will have different kind of experiences and we value all of them. And also we want to create a space where all of us feel welcome. So we are mindful of different physical, language, mental, and safety needs. And we want everybody to feel safe and respected. So we ask you kindly if you feel some way of harassment, violence, and anything, you can report to us, and we will remove from the call anybody who can harass or violent another, or to make another person to feel uncomfortable, or if something happened around that, please don't hesitate to let us know. So that's our principles, and welcome again. And I pass to you, Kimberly, to explain the dynamic from today.
Okay, thanks. So we'll actually move to the song exercise and come back to the word cloud activity machine. So I'll jump in with that. Yeah. So one of the things we wanted to ask all of you is if you can share in the chat a song that makes you feel powerful, that makes you think about freedom, liberation. Our amazing colleague, Cecile, who's part of the Information, Communications, and Media team, has helped to create a musical playlist where we have started collecting songs that make us think about freedom and liberation. And so if you would like, please share a song in the chat that makes you feel powerful. And the songs you put in the chat will help add to our playlist. And so Cecile, if you can drop the playlist link in the chat for folks. And as the conversation continues, we invite you to think about those songs and also add them in the chat. So that's our Freeing Ourselves playlist. Thank you, Irene. Irene has added Respira. Thank you so much. So just continue throwing those songs in the chat. And we will now move on to Mishi, who's going to introduce the panelists.
Yeah, we have an amazing panelist that will lead us to this discussion today. And I just gonna send their names and organizations. And maybe after we have some questions so they can expand on their actually work. So we have today Angelique Nixon, and she's part of CAISO, Sex and Gender Justice in Trinidad and Tobago. Then we have Philippa Tucker from Accountability International. We have Philasande Malakata. She's from Muvu Farmer Support Network in South Africa. I'm sorry if I misspell the names, please let me know when you reintroduce yourself. And then we have Svita Moros from Eurasian Women's Network on AIDS. And as Kimberly said, we have Tamara Jade, who is our amazing facilitator, illustrator, and visual note takers, who will be sharing our thoughts in a different way. So we want to have this conversation also around some questions that we will ask to the panelists, so they can share their thoughts about that. So I want to start by asking them, what is giving you power right now, and how is that fueling your work and the movement you are part of? So we will start with Angelique.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to Kimberly and Nishi and the whole AWID team for having this conversation. I also usually speak quickly, so I'm gonna speak slowly and deliberately. I love this question, so I'm just gonna share my thoughts and what I wrote. So what's giving me power right now? Resistance, global uprisings, Black Lives Matter, indigenous movements, intersectional feminist activism, abolitionist politics, decolonial praxis, healing justice, Black queer love, moon rituals in times of crisis, poetry, art, creativity. These fuel my work and social justice movements I'm active in and organizing with, from LGBTI and queer activism and advocacy to ending gender-based violence, from the struggle for racial and economic justice and Black liberation to sex and gender justice, to ending stigma and discrimination related to HIV and AIDS, and sex work especially. These offer strength and inspire me to keep working. They also remind me of the long arc towards justice, the need for strategy, for a clear intersectional and decolonial politics, to organize across our differences and build meaningful solidarity, to understand deeply and work from the place of the personal is political, learning how to put my body where my politics are, but to also take care of myself radically for myself and for community, to create dangerously, as Edwidge Danticat calls us to do, and to share our stories so wildly and boldly no one can stop us. To speak, knowing it is better, in the words of Audre Lorde, knowing we were never meant to survive. As an artist, focusing on how to share creativity as a pathway for healing. As an activist, listening, changing, learning, growing, and working for transformation. I follow Shawnee Nicholas for astrology readings. I hope that others might know who she is. And I just want to end my reflection with a quote from her that around the new moon that just happened last week. And she shared these words in her post about the new moon, and it just really captured a lot of how I feel these days. To try and count the many ways in which life is out of balance, our institutions are corrupt, and our systems set us up to fail would take us from now until the end of time. To try and tip the scales towards justice will take each and every one of us, all our might, weight, care, and commitment. To do anything else with our life, to waste any of our precious time concerned with anything less would be a life lived in vain. To whatever end and with whatever tools we have at our disposal, being consumed with making space for healing and justice to occur is the only option left. That's Shawnee Nicholas, astrologer, who is amazing. And so that's really been, I think, at the forefront of my mind during these times of crisis before COVID, but I think that in the past 6 months, it's even ever so present. And so what's giving me power is, the hope that we can still create change, and even if it's in the smallest way. And I think that my time is probably up, but I just want to close. I think that some of the most meaningful activism and organizing work I've done in the past 10 or 15 or 20 years has been, I worked in Haiti after the earthquake for 7 years, doing different kinds of grassroots organizing with folks on the ground in Comiers. And, it was really about making small and meaningful change with a group of people and creating that model together around healing, around justice, around food sovereignty, around mental, spiritual wellness, and around art and creativity and healing. And I think for me, that is the kind of work that keeps me going. Finding those linkages in our spaces that are community-led, that are led by people most impacted, whether it's working directly with folks who are doing sex work, whether it's working with folks who are farmers, whether it's working with folks who are most impacted by a prison the prison industrial complex, whatever it is. I think that for me, that's what gives me the power and fuels my work. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelique, for opening the space and those amazing and inspiring words. So we are going to you, Filipa. Thanks.
Thank you, first of all, for having me here. I'm really honored to be in such incredible company. If I could just reach out and just get it all to fall into my soul, I would be so happy. All right, so what's giving us power? So for me, it's less personal and it's more from the organizational perspective, because I think what we do so much at AI, it's really kind of amplifying voices. We know we're mostly staffed with queer and African people. So I'm European African by birth. So I'm not a typical example of our staff. But I think that what we've been talking about is how much it's people's tenacity and commitment in the face of everything that's happened this year in 2020. I think that on the part of most people, you know, there is no option to give up, because giving up basically means death, because if you don't get up and move, you don't get your food for the day. And I think that that is a very important thing that is motivating us and giving us power right now to be at the laptop or in the space or whatever it is, and to do what we do, which is try and bring accountability into many different spaces, because that's really what we specialize in, is kind of bringing accountability, holding duty bearers accountable, and bringing that transparency in. I think the other thing is that I've seen so many people laughing in the face of adversity this year. And I think that when I look at the use of humor and how we can use it to dismantle power and to make leaders look foolish, which they pretty much do themselves, I think that that is something that is definitely helping us to fuel our work. And I mean, the larger movement, I think, you know, the accountability movement, I think what we're seeing now that, you know, we could have gotten grants for 20 years to try to create this interconnectedness that we've been trying to push for years. On our Challenging Criminalization Globally project, we've been trying to get movements to work together. So for example, for road safety, to start working together with the youth movement and the LGBT movement and the women's movement, because young women or young, you know, queer bodies are being sexually harassed on trains, or, you know, young women are having to choose between walking along a dark road and getting hit by a car, or walking across a field and getting raped. And so we're trying to bring movements together to understand how they're not separated and how all this interconnectedness works. And I think that if we take an optimistic approach, which is not to by any means invisibilize the immense pain and suffering that a lot of people have had this year and in previous times, that there is definitely a greater understanding and sense of solidarity across the planet. And I think that is something that is definitely we're enthusiastic about.
Thank you, Filipa. And now we go to Phila Sande.
Hi, good afternoon to everybody. And thank you to AWID for this wonderful space for these conversations between us all. And I agree with both of the speakers. They've pretty much said a lot of the stuff that's in my thoughts, especially with how activist movements are taking up the space to stand up against government and all these other systems that may as they try, but are not really doing enough to protect us as women, as children, as societies. I am finding that there is a lot of awakening happening around me, around the world, globally, and especially now with this pandemic that has hit. Everybody is suddenly having a way of thinking that is independent, that is more personal, rather than being in a space where everybody is comfortable being led, even being led blindly. I am in my personal space where I am working in organizational terms with the cannabis industry. I am finding that the customary law is taking up space, which is for the first time in South Africa. It's been repressed for a very long time, much as a whole lot of us in South Africa have recognized our chiefs and kings as the custodians of the land, the leaders of communities, and people who stand up for their community. They haven't really had a voice. They haven't had the space to express and to participate in leading the country and society at large. And suddenly I am finding that with the cannabis industry, because it is based in the rural settlements, there is no way of avoiding involving traditional leadership within that space. And traditional leadership is mainly male dominated, obviously. But even that is also a little bit changing. You do find now chiefs who are women, which I find absolutely amazing, and looking forward to seeing more of that. People are bending their rules, and it's absolutely just wonderful to be living at this time. It's a weird time to be living in, and like Angelique said earlier on, that giving up is not an option. It isn't an option. We can only bask in what is happening and take glory in being alive and in playing our part in making a difference. So I am appreciating that so much. I get a lot of strength from people standing up for themselves, and it seems it's not just little communities everywhere. It's a global effort. Everybody is talking about the same things, how women need to be protected and all of this. So I am, I'm loving I'm loving being alive and making a difference, however little there is, and especially with movements such as these that are making possible for these conversations to happen, because it's the new leadership. It looks like government is falling away, the leadership in the way that we know it. I can't wait for it to fall away or to start integrating with the real people.
Thank you, Filasande. We are going now to Sita. I don't know if I'm saying correctly your name, but we'll come back to you.
Yeah, hello. My name is Sveta Moroz. I'm really pleased to be here together with you. Greetings from Istanbul, Turkey, where RESURJ Women's Network on AIDS is conducting our regional feminist school for women from key populations and women living with HIV from 5 countries of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And this event is really important for our organization and make me really inspiring about women's rights and how a new movement of women developing and how we understand the linkages between punitive drug policy, HIV response, gender equality, LGBT movement. And today, before this call, I facilitate together with my narco-feminist colleagues session about women who use drugs. And we stressed again that criminalization impedes women's human rights and silence human rights violation of women who use drugs, including the access to services. Women who use drugs are afraid to advocate for themselves, and it's often dangerous for advocates to speak on behalf of women who use drugs. And for us, it's important to have visibility and voices of our community. And I can see more and more women empowered to have their voices in our movement. And we built new coalition with different women's movement. And more frontline women activists advocate for decriminalization of HIV, for decriminalization of drug use. And for me, this voices is my biggest inspiration, and this what really give me power and hope for the better future for most marginalized women and girls in my region. Thank you. I'm glad to be with you all.
Thank you, Svita. I'm now going back to Kimali because she has an interesting proposition to make us to continue this conversation.
Thanks, Mishi. Well, let's manage expectations. We'll see if it's going to be interesting. So we wanted to invite participants to share with us a word that comes to your mind when you think of criminalization. And so Cecile is going to pop in the chat a link that you have to click on. The link will take you to a place where you can just pop in the word. And as the words are coming in, we'll be able to see. So if I'll just wait for Cecile to pop that into the chat. And as you all start to put in a word that comes to your mind when you think of criminalization. So we'll just give you some time to head on over there. And based on your responses, we'll create a word cloud with all of your responses. And so this really helps to give us an idea of where people's minds are at, what your experiences have been, and how you understand the term criminalization. So the words are coming in. So we're hearing things like stigma, power, resistencia, jail, misunderstanding, pain, punishment, violence. So a lot of these words carry really negative stereotypes: isolation, inhumane. Someone did include power, and power could be something good and it could be something that's taken away from us. Machismo, stigma. So thank you so much, everyone. So you can keep those words coming in. And so for the panelists, this kind of gives you a really good sense of where the audience is at. And yeah, so now we'll move on to the next question for the panelists. Thank you for participating in our first word cloud activity. We'll have one more word cloud activity later in the session.
Thank you, Kimali. I love word clouds. That's why I say that it was, and it was amazing to see how people are growing, some words are expanding and other are getting like little and everything. So I think it's a good start point to our next conversation topic. And in that way, I want to just share for a little bit what we are doing in research about criminalization. And because for feminist movement, I think it is very clear that there are ways of criminalization that are unfair against women, for example. And the most important, I think, example is about criminalization of abortion. And we have a very clear idea that that's unfair and that's something that it needs to end everywhere. And we are fighting for there. But sometimes we start in research, we start reflecting about the use of criminal laws and criminalization in a way to defend our rights, and especially sexual and reproductive rights. So we started to question about criminalization as a feminist tool. It is criminalization a feminist tool? So, because we think that criminal law and criminal system are the most violent and discriminatory tools that the state has against people with less power, against Black people, against women, against poor people, and why we sometimes go to those tools to defend our rights without sometimes, I don't know, to have a deeper conversation about that. So we wanted to share these questions, and so we launched with Vecinas Feministas in Latin America and with other partners in different countries in Latin America. We launched the campaign Injusta Justicia, which means unjust justice, which is to reflect about the fault lines of criminalization to protect rights and autonomy of adolescents. And so we use some cases that we collect with our allies in different countries that show how these fault lines can be seen in real life. So and we did that in a way to start a conversation or to continue a conversation. I think this conversation is already there, but we wanted to have other tools to make that conversation going forward. And has been amazing how feminists and women and I don't know, I would say human rights movement approach to the campaign. So okay, I'm gonna share the link of the campaign in the chat box in case someone wants to take a look. It's in Spanish, and I think we have some materials in English, and we are happy to continue this conversation if someone needs to go deeper. So speaking about criminalization, we want to go back to our amazing panelists, and we want to ask them, how do you understand the call to challenge criminalization? So at this time, we're going to go, we're going to flip the order of the speakers, and we're going to start with Vita.
Sorry?
We're going to start with you, Vita.
Okay. First of all, we need to be united when we are starting our advocacy action and advocacy campaign against criminalization. For instance, we are doing call to community groups at the national level, more and provided them support and capacity building to respond to HIV criminalization. Now, for instance, as a regional organization, we support women in Tajikistan and Ukraine to advocate against criminalization of HIV transmission. And our action is built on to promotion of remove of HIV specific laws from legislation, because it's like HIV stigma in general legislation, and we advocate, and also when it's not possible, we advocate to among judges, for instance, to advocate to consider condom use or viral load or threat of violence in case of HIV criminalization. And of course, it's very important to conduct women-led and community-based research on how criminalization can influence on our human rights realization. And of course, we need many allies and supporters. For instance, it could be scientific community and areas. Of course, media is very important because in our region, it's really important role is playing media sector, and very organizing people in particular living with HIV, and punish them for HIV spread and HIV epidemic. So we need to change this attitude towards people living with HIV, to HIV positive women. And of course, it's need to be considered like a violence against women as well. And we include HIV criminalization, drug use criminalization in our advocacy agenda when we are communicated with UN treaty bodies like CEDAW, for instance. And we have a new trend in our women's movement to address these issues through the Commission on Elimination of Form Discrimination Against Women, like CEDAW.
Thank you. Thank you, Zvida. We're now going to Fila Sande.
What comes to mind for me is the reality of who makes the laws and how they come about to make the laws. It's something that it's a conversation that I have with a lot of my peers a lot of times about how the laws that govern us are not really made for us, are not made to favor us in any way. We have recently been introduced to a proposed bill in South Africa to govern cannabis, and it's nowhere near representative of the people who grow cannabis in rural settlements, in rural areas. It prohibits commercialization, and it says that one person can only ever grow 4 plants in a household, and one adult person, and a household can never grow more than 8 plants at a time. And if you fail to adhere to these to this law, fortunately for us, it hasn't been set yet. It is only proposed as a bill. But if it were come to pass, it would definitely put every grower in Bonderland in jail. It would criminalize every person that is growing cannabis, because there is no way. People in Pondoland have been cultivating cannabis illicitly underground and selling it, trading in the underground market, and it has been thriving for as long as time can be remembered. And they have been doing it much as it has been illegal. And now, if you have a set law that says you can only ever grow so many plants, and there's just no way they're able to update that, because we're trying to make a living with the cannabis. So the people who are making these laws, it's as if at the back of their mind, they're trying to create criminals out of innocent people. People are just merely trying to make a living. Nobody is meeting them halfway, trying to understand or trying to meet them halfway, like I said, such that they can also benefit. So the only way that they can continue with their lives is to continue illicitly, which means that a whole community is being criminalized. And it's an uncomfortable position to be at, because it's set by a certain kind of power in certain spaces where little people like us have very little effect on changing that or making it such that it speaks on our behalf. And criminalization is not understanding where people come from. It is not understanding why drug users use drugs. My feeling is that punishment is just not necessary, and it's not a smart way of meeting the problem, because sometimes it's just an innocent person who has landed themselves in a situation where they're using drugs, and it should be their right to do whatever it is they want to do with their body, with their mind. It would help to have some education within that space to let people know this is what you're getting yourself into. But there isn't any effort in place to accommodate the people who are criminalized. Of course, there are different sets of criminals, right? Some people murder, some people choose to work on the streets as sex workers, and they are criminalized rather than finding out alternatives and means for people to do things differently. So it's a concept that I myself personally don't really grasp as to how it came to being that there are jails, that sometimes innocent people are thrown in there. For me, it feels like a racial thing. It feels like a class thing, because sometimes you have people that should actually be criminalized but are not being criminalized, but there's always a focus on certain people. And it's a scary place to be in. And looking at where we are now, it's 2020. We should be able to engage. We should be able to talk about things, to find solutions, to find alternatives, rather than continuously punish people. So my life in that would be, rather than punishing, why not find a meeting point? Why not find a space where people get therapy for various reasons that they are found as criminals?
Thank you, Filasande. Philippa?
First, I must say I agree with my two colleagues, Filasande and Svetlana. I think in addition to that, so kind of building on that, is that at AI, we think about challenging criminalization quite broadly. So because we're not specifically from a particular movement, like the women's movement or the LGBT movement or the HIV movement, in fact, we have staff who come from many different movements. And so we all kind of manage to kind of push the things that we are aware of and that we know of. And that's not to say that we can do all of it, because there's still so much learning that needs to be done for all of us. But when we think about challenging criminalization at AI, we think about challenging the criminalization of houselessness or rooflessness or homelessness and the first, second, and tertiary definitions of that. We think about the criminalization of people on the basis of their migration status. We think about the criminalization of people who are perceived or thought to be the cause of road crashes. So drivers who are maybe drunk and they are criminalized for causing a death because they are perceived to be the cause, where it is actually the system that has allowed that person to be in that position, exactly like it is the system that lets other people down. So it's about moving culpability, accountability to the system and off the individual. We think about the criminalization of activism, the criminalization of political opposition. We think about the criminalization of self-defense, something that very much affects the LGBT community, that affects women, that affects sex workers, you know, many who are kind of close to or next to or integrated into the HIV movement. We think about the criminalization of defacing property, graffiti, and tagging, and the social contract and the lack of a social contract where people are doing that graffiti often as a means to send a message that they're not part of that society because that society has already outed them. So, and then we also think about the criminalization of selective nudity. You know, my 5-year-old son, he feels really bad that he can walk around without a t-shirt, whereas my 7-year-old daughter can't. So selective nudity and how this is criminalized. So I think those are the things that we think about. We think about how we can break down those thematic silos that are enforced on us by usually the development partners with money, the funding partners with money, because they send the money down in silos and in themes. And we think about the colonial inheritances that we have. We think about what we call unusual suspects. So we've done a lot of work, for example, with advertisers in South Africa around the portrayal and inclusion of LGBTIQ people in adverts, and trained over 400 advertisers. And we've seen a considerable change in the way that they portray and include LGBTIQ people in advertising in South Africa. And this is something we also want to do, for example, around criminalization, the portrayal of, you know, people who pass through prisons. We're not prisoners. I've passed through several prisons, but I'm not a prisoner. It is something that happens to me temporarily or something like that. So I think we're an organization who's trying to think through these things and are quite experimental in a lot of what we're doing. But I think that gives you an indication of some of the thoughts that we're having.
Thank you, Philippa. Angelique?
So for me and the work that I do and with CAISO, decriminalization means challenging and changing laws and policy that harm and criminalize people in communities, especially those vulnerable and marginalized. The call to challenge criminalization offers, I think, a space and a framework to help us understand how state violence and the prison industrial complex, how they work. And in particular, systemic violence, colonial violence, and racism, how these are so embedded in our social and legal fabrics of our societies. In the Caribbean region, it is pervasive. It's through our laws, it's through our structures, it's through our education systems. So when we think about that, it's about untangling so much, as Philisande was saying, and Philippa, those connections, they're so threaded through many things. And I think the call to challenge criminalization really asks us to think about a world without prisons, without detention centers, without systems of incarceration. I've done abolition work for a long time through in different organizing spaces. And I think for me, if you include an abolitionist politics, right, in your work, it makes you think about those things. And it really calls upon us to think about a different kind of world. And so I think about decriminalization as a first step to the call, because challenging criminalization is not just about the laws or policy, it's also about cultural shifts and transformation. It's an active response to injustice and discrimination and state violence. And so it means calling out all of those things, however they operate. In the Caribbean region, the call for decriminalization has different kinds of resonances, right? We think about it around challenging the criminalization of sex work, usually termed or called prostitution in our laws and spaces, right? Also around abortion or termination of pregnancy. In the Anglophone Caribbean, most spaces have very strict laws or regulations around sexual acts, as well as termination of pregnancy. Most of the time it's completely criminalized to different degrees of access. In some places it is absolutely legal, but culturally it's not accepted and there's no access. In places like Guyana, for example, there have been a number of studies that show there is abortion, there's a right to termination of pregnancy, but public hospitals don't do it, or rarely. So, you have that issue. So there might be a law in place that is decriminalized, but that doesn't mean that there's been a cultural shift or change. Guyana has had abortion laws since 1995. And then you have the issue of when we think very clearly about what in the colonial context are called buggery laws, right, that criminalize certain kinds of sexual activities. Often we talk about it as criminalizing homosexuality, or LGBTI people are criminalized, but it's about the sex acts that are criminalized, which then therefore creates all of this stigma and discrimination around sex and the body and people who are a part of sex and gender, who are sex and gender diverse and or marginalized because of sexual identity and sexual orientation, as well as gender identity. So you have the ring around decriminalization. I think especially in the Caribbean, you hear it and it really focuses on the buggery laws. But even in places where the buggery laws have been struck down, for example, in the Bahamas for over 20 years, there's still a lot of homophobia and transphobia and intense amounts of it because of religion. So again, I think when we say decriminalization or challenging criminalization, that's only a part of it because in terms of the law, and then there's also culture. I want to talk a little bit about legalizing marijuana. I think we're hearing decriminalization a lot in the context of marijuana use, not so much other drugs, but just marijuana. Sorry, excuse me. And recently in Jamaica and in Trinidad and Tobago, there's been a push to legalize personal use of marijuana. But as Philisande was suggesting too, it's just around 4 plants. I think that's somehow the magic number, 4 personal plants. But then the commercial issue has not been resolved. I think they're doing it in Jamaica, but in Trinidad and Tobago, a lot of folks who are advocating around marijuana laws are pushing that there's no commercial laws. So it's still, you still can be, and people are criminalized for growing, for selling, and so that's very, very challenging as well. And so you know, laws, again, are one part of the work of challenging criminalization. It is also about how do we shift culture, how do we transform, and how do we decolonize our institutions and indeed ourselves. And so for us at CAISO, Sex and Gender Justice, we focused for the past 10 years in really thinking about how do we shift perspectives and understanding around sex and gender diversity. We spent a lot of time challenging media representations. You know, 5, 6 years ago, you would often see terms like quote unquote homosexual or just lesbian or gay. But now you read the papers and very often you see LGBTI plus and also clear distinctions, you know, that, and I think that we get called upon to speak on issues related to sex and gender diversity. And this has included advocating and supporting sex workers, LGBTI folks in a range of different experiences, trans folks in particular, having conversations about trans and intersex issues in public spaces, supporting persons living with HIV, working to end gender-based violence and expanding what we understand gender-based violence to be, that LGBTI discrimination is a form of gender-based violence, and connecting misogyny and sexism to homophobia and transphobia, I think is super important, and how those things are racialized and also very much classed. And so, you know, just recently thinking about what does it mean to advocate for sex and gender justice and sexual rights and bodily integrity also means you have to make these multiple connections and expand our understandings and notions of what it means to think about sex and sexuality. And, you know, thinking about something that we've done recently, we just did a training for migrants, LGBTI migrants here in Trinidad, who come from a variety of places. But when we think about rights, I mean, even though there's access to human rights in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, and if one seeks asylum here under different international asylum treaties, one still has to struggle with what it means to be a migrant who's undocumented, and also dealing with multiple forms of marginalization based on one's sexuality or gender identity. And so we did an advocacy and activist training for folks. We did it online, and it was, you know, a moment where we got to talk about all of these intersections and, you know, what does it mean to create space for LGBTI migrants to have a voice and to organize with us. And I think that that's an example of the kinds of work, like when we think about challenging criminalization, there's so many levels and so many ways that we have to do it. So yeah, I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Angelique. I will pass back to Kimali.
Yeah, thanks. This was really, really interesting. And there were a lot of comments in the chat from audience members agreeing, saying this is resonating, that it's really also about shifting how we understand crime, who determines who's a criminal and who is not. So just want to say thank you to the audience for engaging in the chat, and thank you to all of you panelists, and welcome back, Sveta. So we just heard from all of you your thoughts around what it means to challenge criminalization. You spoke a bit about who it's working for and who it's working against. And so we wanted to shift a bit before we take some questions from the audience. So audience members, if there are questions that you're sitting with, we encourage you to put it into the Q&A box if you have not already. And if you are having trouble accessing the Q&A box, you can put your question in the chat. And try to think about questions that you think the panelists could respond to. So we'll come to those in about 5 minutes or so. 7. But I just wanted to take this time to hear from the panelists and to sort of shift gears a bit. We've been talking a lot about resistance and the very real impacts that you know, legislation and policies that are not geared towards our collective well-being, the real impacts that those can have on our lives and how they can criminalize us. And so we wanted to shift gears a bit to hear from you maybe one example of what you have witnessed in terms of moving or using resistance to transform and to create freedom. So what are some transformative solutions that you have seen movements, or maybe you have been part of, that you've seen what movements do in the face of resistance? So what are some of the creative transformative solutions that movements are engaging with? So if maybe you can share one example, maybe it could be an example you've seen or an example you're part of. And so we'll just see who has an example first, who wants to jump in. We won't necessarily go in a round. Whoever feels ready to share. Yeah, all yours, Philippa, all yours.
I'll jump in because it's one of the best pieces I've seen. And it makes me so excited anytime I think about it. So the person who did the work was, I mean, I've seen many, because on our project, Challenging Criminalization Globally, we work with RESURJ, and Mishi completely understated that project. It's incredible. Okay. We work with CREA. We've seen so many good examples of the work that is done, but there's this one has always touched me very deeply. A young person called Estefania Villabarba in Mexico did a very simple piece of research that I felt was very powerful, and she presented it at the first Challenge Criminalization Globally meeting that we had, and was literally looking at the impact of a specific law, a family law that was brought in Mexico. And the law was designed, it was brought in by the women's movement as a means to protect women from violence within the home and from family violence. And Estefania's research clearly showed, through a course of years of research, showed that the stick that had been created by the women's movement was being used against women. More women had been imprisoned for longer periods of time, and their children had been worse affected, and their other dependents, elderly parents perhaps, or siblings, or anybody else that women care for, had been worse affected by this law that had been put in place. And for me, whenever I hear the word criminalization, I think of a stick, because this was really it. When we create a stick, it gets used against those who are the most discriminated and the most not lacking in power, but who are actively disempowered by the current structural systems that are in place. And so, you know, if you have less money and less socioeconomic income, if you have lower formal education, if you're maybe somewhere on the spectrum of feminine or a woman or trans or queer, if you are perhaps darker skinned, anything like that, migrant status, all of the things that my colleagues have mentioned, any of these things, that stick will be used against you. So that one powerful piece of research.
Thank you, Philippa. Does anyone else have an example that you would like to share?
I can share. I just want to share an example of what some of the work that CAISO has been doing, and how, so one of the things, you know, in the face of dealing with laws that are anti-discriminatory, in Trinidad, we have a really amazing piece of legislation called the Equal Opportunity Act that but defines, it's supposed to protect people in terms of housing, employment, and access to goods and services and education on the basis of a range of things like race, ethnicity, religion, geographic origin, class, socioeconomic status, and sex. That's what the act says. But then in the definition of sex, it says sex does not include sexual orientation. And so it's an act that explicitly excludes folks on the basis of sexual orientation. It also doesn't include issues around health conditions like HIV status and also age. So about 9 years ago, CAISO started a coalition across different human rights organizations to add 3 protected statuses to this piece of legislation, which is age, health conditions, and LGBTI status. But of course, it means fighting against this exclusion. Well, it's been 9-10 years and we still haven't changed it. Decriminalization has happened in 2018 around the buggery laws, but that's under appeal and will be probably for years. So in the meantime, we're still fighting against this. So what CAISO did, and as, okay, well, we've been doing that for years, let's try something else. We created a program called Wholeness and Justice, which is really about how do we get LGBTI Trinbagonians access to wholeness, justice, and human services. And so we created a program that includes legal and social work professional staffing, peer navigation around services, and how to empower folks in the community to access these services and push against the government to include people. So part of it is crisis intervention, emergency support, legal advocacy, counseling, and building around people's understanding of justice and systems. And we're also going to do strategic. This is all starting. It started earlier this year. But with COVID, we had a lot of pivots, but we are gearing up. We're hiring lawyers, a social worker, and staff to support folks. And what we want to do is do strategic litigation around gender identity. So calling upon folks who've experienced any kind of human rights violation around their gender identity to see how we can push this particular issue of non-inclusion. Gender is interestingly included in the legislation in different kinds of ways, so we want to push against that and see how much we can move and shift. But at the same time, I think what's transformative about the program is that we're able to shift and meet the needs of folks, like understanding we can't push against laws without ensuring that people have safety, security, and have the support that they need. And so the casework and social work aspect of it and access to wholeness from psychological services and support and counseling to helping navigate a system to get different kinds of social services, I think is a part of our vision of like, how do we push against the system, use what's available, and make sure that LGBTI folks get access to it. And that will also include migrants and sex workers and folks who need any support, especially if they are made vulnerable because of sex or gender. So I think I mean, we're still working through the program and we've started, but I think it's an example of like, we have a system that's not moving, so how do we push against it, but also ensure that folks have access to justice?
Thank you, Anjali. And audience members, you might also have an example of transformative work that you're involved with or that you know is happening around the world in your own backyard. So please feel free to share those in the chat as well. So any other panelists, do you have an example of a transformative solution? Yes, Sveta.
Yeah, we understand that criminalization, either real in law or perceived in practice, of certain identities of women justifies and in some cases sanctions discrimination and perpetration that criminalized women are stripped of their other rights, including the rights to health, to be free from violence and degrading treatment, and to justice. And we work together with our communities to stop self-victimization and self-stigmatization. For us, it's really important to change inner perception of ourselves as the criminals. Because when women feel themselves as the criminals, they behave accordingly. That is why society, government, law enforcement can manipulate, abuse, and violate our rights. And we want to empower our women don't feel and behave like criminals, to have dignity, to have voice, to understand and realize their rights. And now we are building the movement of paralegal activities when women from national organization, local organization, help other women to Um, for example, those who suffering of HIV criminalization to represent in the courts, to communicate with the prosecutors. And we have a great example in Belarus last year, when because of advocacy action of our activists, they how to say, they change the law and parliament accept amendments to the criminal code, which how to say, it's no prosecution for those who be inform their partners about. So it's additional protection for people living with HIV.
I see. Thank you so much, Sveta. Yeah, I think sometimes the sound is a little affected by maybe the video, but I think we definitely heard what you were sharing, challenging how folks understand who's a criminal, so not seeing themselves as being criminal.
Yeah.
And so changing that mindset also changes the action, like the actions they engage with, but also how women are coming together to support each other across organizations. So yeah, thank you so much. So we're about to move to the Q&A from participants, but I just want to see if Philisande, did you have an example that you wanted to share of a transformative solution being done by movements?
I quite like the approach from the likes of the drug policy movements. We have one in South Africa that, like anybody else, is advocating for the complete freedom to do with your body as you please. And I like that approach, and it's not a very popular one or common one. Hence, all the need to criminalize people, because the powers that be feel like they need to have a hand in what people do with their lives. So I like the fact that there is that kind of platform that is challenging, government and policymakers in terms of what people can and cannot do with their bodies. And like you say, it's difficult to tell who is a criminal and who's not. And in the case where I'm doing what I like with my body, who's to say that I'm a criminal if I'm not causing harm to anybody else? Hence, I come back to that thought that perhaps rather than punishing people, we could try and find out why it is that they are where they are. Therapy needs to be implemented, but yeah, I could say that approach of harm reduction rather than criminalizing people has been standing out for me. And I'm also just getting around learning how much more of these initiatives there are in South Africa, which I really, really appreciate. But it's really difficult to get through to government sectors that and policymakers in, for instance, in terms of actually getting them to approach the criminalization in a different place. And
Yeah.
I feel like maybe like I always have a question in terms of having conversations such as these ones. How much of them are getting to the people that need to be in these conversations? We are talking to ourselves right now in this conversation without the people that are actually making the laws. So it would be great if we could start finding ways of integrating ourselves, the activist movements, and the policymakers, the lawmakers, to kind of like influence the change in how it is perceived.
Thank you, Philisande. So we have about 9 minutes left. I just want to invite audience members before, if you can just complete a quick survey to help give us a sense of how these conversations are landing. Is it accessible? Is it clear? So that we can do better at our work. And so please, I'll ask one of my colleagues to just pop the surveys in the chat. They'll be in English, French, and Spanish. It will take you less than 5 minutes, hopefully. But yeah, it's just really helpful for us to get feedback from you all. Tamara, Jade, I also wanted to check in with you. How are you feeling? You've been capturing our thoughts. If you want to like maybe show us what you've been working with. Did you have anything you wanted to say quickly?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm going to add more to it, but yeah, I've got loads of information. I'm happy to kind of show you a bit closely if I can. Sorry, hang on. So we have the topic, and then I had people's faces who were on the panel. And then so the stuff, here's the stuff that people were talking about were powering them. Then I went over here to kind of do some things around what people understand by challenging criminalization. Lots of people were talking about different things that were criminalized, so I popped that down here. And then so far I'm doing the transformative solutions over here.
Thank you so much. I'm happy you're with us. So looking at the time and considering that we're almost down to the wire, I really interchange metaphors in the oddest of ways. I don't even know if that was a fitting metaphor, but we're almost done. And we do have, I think, two big questions from the audience. So the questions from the audience really speak to how we can engage in transnational solidarity, considering that we're all in different geographical, social, political spaces. So how can we engage in transnational solidarity? And there was also a question from someone about like how can we create, or should we create, a sort of international entity that helps to ensure there's accountability of the laws and sort of to protect the changes made by feminist movements. So I think it's like two big questions. One question is really around like transnational solidarity across movements. And the other piece is more of a structural place that we can use to sort of help ensure accountability. So I don't know if anyone, all of you don't have to comment, but does anyone feel compelled to respond to either or both of these questions? And maybe we can try to keep the responses to about a minute each. Does anyone feel compelled? So what can we do to sort of foster transnational solidarity, and thoughts around creating a structural international entity for accountability?
Sunday? Go ahead.
You want to go, Philisande?
I think having these kind of conversations is a good start because I mean, how else is it going to come out there and surface to everybody else that these are subjects that need to be spoken about? Having them and continuing with them and engaging with, like I say, with the people that make the laws, with the people that hold the powers, and as well, not necessarily like depend entirely on government to run with it, but to force our way, basically, to say that we would like to be listened to and to be heard. And the whole issue with maybe, for instance, gender-based violence, like harassment to women and children, much as government wants to play a hand in that, they might not have all the power to be able to do it. And entities such as ourselves are needed to play in that space and to to create formulas that can gather people on a global scale, as it has been during now the lockdown, as it has been with I observed what was happening in the US and marveled at how at the reaction that the rest of South Africa had with the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance. And I think it has become a global movement. And things like that need to, as soon as they gain that momentum, they need to continue rolling, flowing with it, and persisting that we hear. We want to speak for ourselves. We can't necessarily always just look up to government to help us. For instance, we can't really look up to the police to help us for anything, much as they are the law enforcement. They are the ones that also harass us. They are the ones that also kill us. So we actually have to wake up to the fact that we are all that we have. We are all that we've got. We don't have government, we don't have police, we don't have law enforcement. So my feeling is we just need to strengthen the movements and to keep the communication going, to keep the movement going.
Thank you, Philip Sande. Angelique, you wanted to speak? You have about 30 seconds. Sorry about that.
Oh, just to say, I think we need to learn from each other. You know, the prompt for this event is we are the ones we've been waiting for. But I think when it comes to transnational solidarity, we have to listen. We have to be led by local and regional organizers and activists. And so we have to be careful we don't replicate harmful patterns. And accountability means that we need to think deeply about the regional differences, especially around things like sex and sexuality. I mean, the Caribbean is seen as paradise, right? And we need to constantly do battle with that because there isn't a moral panic around, say, sex trafficking in the way that it is in other spaces, and certainly less around like domestic labor and work. So I mean, there's so many layers, I think, to how we think about these issues. So I think listening and providing opportunities around transnational solidarity like this, I think are key. And like Philip Sande said, I think Black Lives Matter has given us so much, so many ways to think about what it means to be specific and local to your context, but also speak to the larger movement in terms of justice and organizing.
Thank you so much, Angelique. So I'll pass it over to Mishi.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you all. I think we got with more questions and we need to continue the conversation in other spaces. Thank you very much to all our amazing panelists. Thank to all the people that came to the space and put their comments and questions in the chat box. I know that you can see all them and try to connect also. Maybe it would be nice. And I just want to thank all of you and also remind you of the upcoming event as part of AWIT's Feminist Realities Journey. And the next will be Rainbows Storms, LGBTQI plus climate crisis and pandemics, which is a really amazing and important topic these days. And it would be on Wednesday, October 28th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. East and 10 to 11:30 a.m. Fiji time. So centering queer voices, we will learn from Diva and Equality Fiji how to set up community-owned aquaponic gardens, collective cleaning of rivers, or organized queer women builders network. So it will be amazing, and we hope to see you all there in that space. So remember, we have shared the survey, and we thank you all and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Interpreters, thank you to the AWIT staff. Thank you so much, Mishi, and all of you. And so check out our resources on our website, and we will be in touch. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Buddy.
Thank you. Cheers.